Good, good. Thank you so much, Benji. It's a pleasure to see your different faces, and I know several of you. So I'm always happy to see friends here, and hopefully I'll make friends with the rest of you as well. I've been living in the Twin Cities here of Minnesota for about 35 years. We came here in 1985 to work with international students in a ministry, and it was soon after we came here that something became very evident to me as I would meet international students, and a great many of our students historically have come from China. That's going to change dramatically in the next couple of years, but historically they've come from China. And if you look over my shoulder, you'll see the banner that's got a traditional Chinese saying on it. But I found that the students, whether they came from China or the very few that we knew from Latin America, others from Eastern Europe or from Africa, the story always was the same. When it came to them talking about what was their biggest challenge back home, it was always corruption. And I thought early on, this is a big deal. And if we're going to be serious about preparing these students to be active followers of Christ in their home societies, then we're going to have to address this. So as early as the mid-90s, we had a speaker who addressed the topic. In 98, we had the same speaker address the topic again. And then really, as we launched the Wilberforce Academy around 2009, I knew that was going to be one of the foci for what we're doing with international students. And so that's the backdrop, the background to the work that I do. I was never trained in this field, so to speak, but it's by virtue of learning from my students that I am doing what I'm doing. Let me share my screen with you now, and we'll get started here. Let's see if this is the right one. No, there we go. I want to use this one. Okay, so I'm going to navigate from the side here. So I'm not filling the screen with this, but I think you can see it pretty well. So one of the things that I developed a few years ago as I was looking at this and thinking about the phenomenon of corruption from a more scholarly perspective was the development of what I call the four streams model. And so I was asking myself, if we try to evaluate why corruption exists, is it monocausal or is it multicausal? That's an obvious question that scholars like us would ask. And it was pretty evident to me that you could not talk about it in any other way than multicausally. So I developed what I'm calling the four streams model here. Now, before we get into the model, which I want to talk about right away, I want to state the problem. That'll just take a very brief time. Then we'll talk about the model so you understand it, and I'll welcome your feedback, your suggestions, as well as your critique. Then we're going to obviously apply that model to the question, why do we not disciple for integrity? So I'm restating the functional question today to change it slightly. Why do we not disciple for integrity? And then finally conclude with one slide on recommendations. So our problem, of course, is that as a matter of Christian discipleship, the anecdotal data that we have and any kind of other more systematic research data suggests that Christians, except for groups like us, have been historically paying relatively little attention to bribery and corruption. And especially, this is where the focus is, especially with respect to Christian discipleship. It does not appear in any meaningful way to be part of the discipleship programs that I can identify, not only in North America, but in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, Latin America, and so forth. So the question, of course, then is, why do we not disciple for integrity? That is our functional question. So I have a particular definition of corruption that obviously picks up on the traditional definition of private gain that is sought at public expense. That's the traditional definition. But I add at the beginning the social and personal decay that results from private gain that is sought at public expense. And the reason I do that is something that will be evident in one of my slides here, but it really gets to the concept of the English word corruption. That word is all about decay, and I don't see that we can define the phenomenon without including its effects. The cause is private gain sought at public expense, but we need to, I believe, include effects in our definition. So the four streams and what will come together in my mind as one mighty torrent. So you as followers of Christ who are active in the faith and public integrity network will agree with me that we are by nature as human beings sinful. We are essentially primordial sinners. Sin goes way back into the human race. So it's primordial, but in addition to that, the second stream I identify is what I call pre-modern shamanism. And other scholars have also identified that, though I don't refer to these scholars in our presentation. I think the assumption that I find in most research literature, and you do too, is that the modern state is the solution. You can see that in most of the more traditional texts on corruption. But what I think I'm going to hopefully find you agreeing with me is that the modern state is actually a huge reason why corruption is such a big problem. And then finally, I'm very concerned about the rise of postmodernism and what I think is postmodern suspicion. So when I give this talk in popular context, the title is Sin, Shamanism, Suspicion, and the State. So let's look at the first stream. Again, I inferred that we needed to pay attention to the core meaning of the word corrupt. That's the English word. But if you go back to the Hebrew and Greek words from which we have our biblical translations, you'll find that both of them refer to the destruction that is due to rotting and spoilage. So it destroys what it touches. Now, what's interesting here, and the reason I'm citing this passage in Genesis, is that this is the first passage in our English Bibles where the word corrupt appears. In fact, it appears 3 times in Genesis 6, verses 11 through 12. And you can see the highlighting of the word corrupt there. So the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that it was so corrupt and how humans had corrupted their way on the earth. And of course, this is the prep before the Noahic flood. But what's interesting here, and I only discovered this as I began to research the Hebrew words used here, is that the very same word used in verses 11 and 12 for corrupt is used in verse 17, several verses later, when God says, I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life and every creature with the breath of life under it. So corrupt and destroy, same Hebrew word. So it appears what God is saying here is that the corruption of human beings has so destroyed the earth that I have no choice as their creator but to corrupt, that is, to destroy those who are destroying my creation. Now, what's significant here is, remember, if you go back to Genesis 1, 26 through 28, it's very clear that human purpose, according to that passage, is that we are designed by God to steward, that is, to take care of and manage the rest of creation. And so, what we've done, instead of managing it and taking care of God's creation, we have destroyed it. At least that was the description of what had happened at this point in history. And so, of course, then God has to destroy those who are the destroyers of his own creation. So now let's look at the second stream, what I call pre-modern shamanism. And what we find in the shamanistic cultures, or the culture of witchcraft, often called animism or folk religion, is a transactional culture where the objective that a human being has in such cultures is to be blessed. And often, because most animists view reality in a zero-sum way, to seek your neighbor's suffering. So if your neighbor is succeeding, that means you're suffering. So you get in contact, you pay a shaman or a witch doctor to get in contact with the spirits, so they will become your ally and they will become the enemy of your neighbor, and you'll become wealthy, your neighbor will lose. So it's a game you play back and forth, but it's very transactional, and it involves payments to get, the spirit world to do something for you. So what happens, and some scholars that I have researched have identified this, and they've said, yes, it's obvious to them that in many cases, that transactionalism gets transferred over to government officials who become proxies for shamans. They become the powerful entities that you then somehow pay off in order to get what you want. And so otherwise, in a more massive political framework, when you have a representative of a tribe or ethnic group who is elected to the most powerful position in government, as Michaela Wrong has titled her book, "It's Our Turn to Eat." And when I talk with many of my African student friends, they all know what that's about. They all know. So we, I think, have some sort of not only anecdotal, but we might say research quality evidence. The Corruption Perceptions Index obviously has all kinds of methodological issues. We could spend all day debating, but generally this is still accepted as I think most people view this as the gold standard. Maybe some of you don't, but I've accepted it that way up to this point. The index is updated every year. It's a 100-point scale. So if you're a society that everybody thinks has no corruption, perfectly non-corrupt, you get 100 points. If you're absolutely corrupt to the core, you're going to get 0 points. I have chosen to view a score of 33 or below as evidence of a highly corrupt society. Others may choose a different cutoff point. But if you look at the 2019 results, you'll see that there are 61 societies, that is 1/3 of the nations that are evaluated. They're highly corrupt. And 44 of those 61 are historically animist. I think that we need to look at historic influences if we're going to make sense of this. And the rest of them are historically Islamic or communist. And if you look, interestingly, at the 10 least corrupt, which have a score between 80 and 89, you're going to find that 8 of the 10 are historically Protestant. So now let's go on, because time is racing. My biggest concern is the misunderstanding about the role of the state. I believe this is where the greatest problems, or where this thing comes together. The biggest stream that's contributing to the torrent of corruption is the modern state. We assumed with modernity that when you replace the pastor and the shaman with a policymaker in the society and the scientist, you would result in a wonderful, successful society. Max Weber, of course, has his old well-known understanding of the Gesellschaft, the complex society of modernity compared with Gemeinschaft, with a traditional community. In Gesellschaft, you have impersonal rules, bureaucracy, technology. Working together, you can ensure fairness and flourishing. And so you would assume that the modern state brings the end to corruption. But instead, I argue exactly the opposite. First of all, the institutions of modernity are so vast and so many, they provide many enormous avenues for corruption. Secondly, many governments have built-in assumptions that bribes are part of a government employee's compensation. You're all familiar with this phenomenon. Thirdly, when you replace the modern state, replace the pre-modern world, which was often animistic, but a world often governed by elders and communities, elders with powers to control people. When you replace that with the modern state, you lose the community controls of pre-modernity. So I'm not entirely condemning pre-modernity. I can see some strengths in it. And so the individual then becomes what I call a moral free ranger, with no one to sort of check him other than the rules and laws that the modern state sets up. But there are many ways to get around those. Fourthly, the modern state is a giant money pot. Anybody who works in government services in many countries of the world knows this is a ticket to money, and this is not disputable. Fifthly, modernity forbids Christian controls because modernity is an attempt to replace Christian faith and its regulatory powers of Christendom, but it tries to smuggle in Christian values without accepting Christian metaphysic. I think that's disastrous. Then you have the problem of the principal agent. You set up rules, but you can't ensure that your agents will follow them. And finally, you have the fox guarding the henhouse problem. I mean, as you can see, I view the modern state as an enormous problem here. So you have, for example, you have a judge who is expected to act and make a judgment about when an accusation is brought against another government official. The judge is expected to rule justly. But remember, the judge works for the same government that the government official works for. It's very likely that they encounter each other through their government employment in formal as well as informal settings. How can we expect anything less, in my view, than massive corruption? So you can see I'm quite dismal on the role of the state, and I welcome your pushback if you want to do so. Finally, postmodern suspicion. I'm trying to portray with this illustration here the idea of power, and that is so central in postmodernism. So justice in postmodernism is all about rectifying power imbalances. You learn to suspect all claims to truth as masquerades for rating others' legitimate sovereignty. So then you redefine truth, not as what corresponds to reality, but what works to rectify power imbalances. And so the net effect is that we're training students in America, and I'm deeply concerned about this, to not view truth as what corresponds to reality, but what works in order to rectify power imbalances. And it's very easy to rationalize that when you get in power in many settings, and to justify your behavior because you no longer believe in truth. So the way I put this is corruption is, among other things, a betrayal that is of reality that is shadowed by shame. I'm not able to see all of what I've written here, but hopefully you can see the quote, which is one that I wrote, and I think captures the essence of what we're dealing with. But I'd like to get on now. to the question, why do we not disciple for integrity? That is really the question that you're here about. We have just about 4 minutes. First of all, we fail to see the relationship between corruption and social destruction. That is, we have never really had a serious discussion in a big way, as far as I know, about the role of primordial sin and what it does to society. We have text about this, but I think we need to frame it inside of the phenomenon of corruption. Secondly, as you can see here, I suggest, for the same reasons of the lure of primordial sin, that to confront corruption is a high cost factor to church leaders. If you're a pastor, I can almost guarantee in most places in the world, at least in societies that don't have a strong Christian background, your biggest giver is a government official. And you are not going to shut that down because your livelihood depends on that. And so if you confront corruption, you may lose your biggest giver. That's a big problem. Number three, I believe that we can say that the surrounding culture tends to blind us to biblical ethics. That is, we normalize corruption. And there I see stream number two, the traditional ethics of the community, my group versus your group. You tend to accept corruption as just part of the way things function. I've talked with many students, for example, from the continent of Africa, who just look at me and they say, Bob, in my country, it's just the way things are done. And besides, if you try to fight it, you're going to lose. You have no choice, so you've got to participate in it. Number four, I believe that the sacred secular divide, which is a product of Western thinking, which views Christianity as for personal morality, not for the marketplace or for broader society, is another reason we're not discipling for integrity. And I believe that is connected to stream number three, the effect of modernity in our thinking. Number five, evangelism is prioritized over discipleship. And I think once again, churches have been seduced by modernity. And so we have subtly moved the ball. Instead of Jesus saying, therefore go and make disciples, we have said in one way or another, therefore go and evangelize. But Jesus did not say that. I wrote an essay for a popular audience called Fattening the Wolves. If you want a copy of it, I'd be glad to. This addresses this very problem. Truth is devalued. That's, of course, the postmodern reality, point number 6. And finally, I don't see this coming from any particular stream, but I think that our missiology has been deficient all along. And the missiology, essentially missionaries, ever since the founding of the modern missionary movement, 1793 with William Carey, these missionaries came out of historically Protestant societies where to one degree or another, over time, integrity had become the moral norm. But no one who was training them was telling them, you're going into societies where integrity is not the moral norm. And so they were not taught that when you make converts, you need to disciple them for integrity because they don't have a background culture that says, be honest. Their background culture says the trickster ethic, take advantage of your neighbor if you can, or utilize the spirits to get their wealth so you can have it. So I believe these are the 7 reasons. I'm going to close here with some recommendations on what we can do. I think one thing, we've got to foreground the law of God in our discipleship. We've got to talk about the law much more. We, as evangelicals, at least those who are evangelicals in this conversation, know that we're rightly obsessed with grace, but we've gone too far and ignored the law of God. Big problem. The second bullet point is we need to teach disciples how to resist the pressures of the tribal group, the family group, and the community that are pressuring you for helping them to survive, especially the phenomenon of demand sharing. I've done some recent scholarship on demand sharing. This is a huge problem in my research, and I'll be glad to talk more about demand sharing later on if you'd like. Hands-on mentoring is required. We've got to have people who are willing to be in the society with people, helping them to work through the challenges. Fourthly, I think we have to really, and this would be more for pastors, but I think we need to revisit Ephesians 3:10. When I look at the commentaries, at least in English, they're a mess. They generally slide over Ephesians 3:10. But Ephesians 3:10 is the only place in the Bible where you see the word ecclesia, which is the Greek word for church. It's the only place in the Bible where ecclesia is used, and it's connected to a purpose statement. And the purpose there is God's intent was, this is what Paul wrote, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God has been made known to the rulers and authorities in heavenly places. I'd be glad to talk about that. That probably raises some questions for you, but I think this is pointing towards discipleship for transformation. And last of all, my book on taming the beast, I'm not trying to be a promoter here, really not. But that's the English version. This is the French translation that was done recently, actually in Africa. That is not a scholarly text. It's designed to be used with lay people. It's a series of 12 imaginative stories that teach a biblical theology of corruption. Okay, it's 9:34. You probably have a lot of things you can say to me, and I'll welcome your critique, your pushback, and your questions.
Yes, as you do share your questions, comments, please, if you wouldn't mind, share your name, where you are calling from, and if you're working for a particular organization.
Roberto.
Thanks, Bob. You did a great job of packing all of this in such a short time. I mean, there's so much. We could spend hours here. Very quickly, there are just two points. The first point is about the modern state. When I think about the modern state, I think about things like the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and impartial bureaucracy. So I'm wondering whether the problem is the modern state or the lack of a culture that informs the modern state. Because when I think about the modern state, I believe that the modern state is very much a result, largely a result of Christian thought. When you think about people like John Locke, Roger Williams, the founders of the US Constitution. So I'm trying to understand why you put that as an obstacle when I would think that, the countries today that have a strong modern state, like the Scandinavian countries, some of the European countries, are the ones with lower corruption.
That's a very good point.
And if I look at the US, just an example, the US had strong clientelism in the early 1800s, mid 1800s. And then it took, a few generations to move to more merit-based bureaucracy, which I would consider a modern state. I would consider that progress, the same as in UK. So anyway, I wanted to sort of understand a bit more what you meant about modern state. The second point, you talk about a strong Christian background and associate that with low corruption.
That had to do with the statistics on corruption. Yeah, right.
Yeah, how do you define strong Christian background? Because we have many countries that have a very strong Christian presence in Latin America, and side by side with high levels of corruption, same as in Africa.
Certainly. Sure.
even countries that are majority Protestant today. So how do we define a strong Christian background?
Okay, that's a very good question. So fortunately, these slides are right next to each other. I'm going to be able to slip back. I'm really glad you pushed back on the state issue. I mean, I'm certainly open to this critique. I think what I want to emphasize when I have the third stream here, I want to emphasize the modern. That's where I want to put the focus, is modernity, and much less on the state. Now, it may have, I can understand why you are pushing back, because precisely, I agree that people like Locke were profoundly influenced, in his case, by his Puritan pastor father. But I think the founders of the state and the current promoters of the state, and by the way, I'm not a postmodern opponent of the state. That's not where I'm coming from. But the promoters of the state have been blithely naive in failing to recognize that you have to have a pre-existing culture that sustains a healthy state, such as you find in the Scandinavian societies. In particular, they are the #1 in the world. There's no question. So I think the emphasis here is on modernity, and maybe I need to revisit this and challenge modernity, not the modern state. So I welcome interaction about this issue. So I think this is a very critical question. My point, once again, is the pre-existing culture is going to determine realities much more than the actual visible laws and institutions of the state. Now, your other question is a very, very good one as well, and I love talking about this. You emphasized that I said strongly Christian. Now, if you look, that was probably intentional, but I was intentionally saying historically Protestant. 8 out of the 10 least corrupt are historically Protestant. Now, three things I want to say here. One, the emphasis on historic. I make a big deal about this, and I do so because the guy who at University of Michigan, who's the founder of the World Values Survey, which I think is one of the best databases we have for doing social science research comparatively across the world.
Sorry, just repeat that name. Sorry, Bob, I've lost that name.
Certainly. The guy's name is Ronald Engelhart. Ronald Engelhart, Inglehart. I believe that's correct. He is a professor at University of Michigan. He developed the World Values Survey about 25 or 30 years ago. I think it's unique in that it does such a wonderful job of going into societies and providing comparative social science data, and it does regular updates. He emphasizes in his research, which is based on the World Values Survey, that you cannot make sense of social phenomena unless you look back at the historic influences. So that helps me with one of your implied questions there, Roberto, which is why is it, in fact, that the more recently Protestant nations, and I'm not saying Christian, I'm just sticking to Protestant, the more recently Protestant majority nations have extremely high rates of corruption. And I challenge you, if you want to study that, look at CPI. Look at nations that have 50% or more Protestants, and nations where the missions movement started no sooner than the late 19th century. You will find extremely high levels of corruption. Whereas in nations where their founding as Protestant societies goes back more or less to the Reformation, you have exactly the opposite. And I think it's all related to the view of the Christian's obligation to God, and the idea that Christianity, Protestantism was a full-orb worldview. There was no sacred secular divide. What I think is happening today, this is a hypothesis, is that the modern mission movement was largely founded in the wake of the Kantian divide, and Locke was part of it to some degree, but Kant especially, between rational scientific knowledge and religious knowledge, which is treated as irrational. And therefore, the Christianity that we missionized in much of the world, for example, in the continent of Africa, was a Christianity that had a built-in sacred secular divide that was all about evangelism, not about discipling people for the law of God. So I think this is really critical. My point with respect, since I'm really emphasizing Protestant, I think the Latin countries, historically Roman Catholic, going back 4 or 5 centuries at least, I think that we're dealing there with a historic Catholic culture that did not have in ways that I don't fully understand, the ability to truly convert whole societies, and which probably mainstreamed lay corruption, even though it may have tried to train a priest to be non-corrupt. So those are some general observations. Thank you. Those are excellent questions. Yes, sir, Harry, and then the gentleman above Harry. So Harry, you go next.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. I think my question is 2 parts. The one is we're sort of looking at historical references, trying to trace back where did it all go wrong, and saying, okay, the Protestant, that's maybe a little bit above my pay grade, so to speak. But looking at a current situation as a younger man and saying, okay, well, all this historical stuff happened, I still got to fix what's happening in front of me now.
Right.
Do I adjust? I know what my what is, but do I adjust my how? Or what I'm hearing you saying, no, we should just stick to our guns and continue with sort of Christian ethics, discipleship methods, and not move to this values-based angle, which a lot of people have taken. My experience has certainly been that we close about 80% of doors that we attempt to enter into if we want to talk about some of the ethical work we do as evangelism. So where we say, hey, we want to come and teach the kids about Jesus and all that stuff, like, oh, no, you can't come in. But we go, hey, we're going to come and teach the kids about values. Then they say, oh, please come in. Now, that issue of, do I want the door to completely shut on me and then just hopefully by some miracle it does open, or I just go through the doors that are open to my overtly Christian approach, and I leave the whole values thing, it certainly would be in my current situation a very limiting factor. I would struggle to get into a number of places where I was then over time able to build relationships and then disciple and then preach the gospel. So that has been the angle we've taken to some degree. So I think that is the one aspect of my question is, do we know what the what is, but should we adjust the how, or should we just leave that process and say, no, we should stick to our guns and always be very overtly Christian in our approach? That would be what I'm hearing, and just my question on that.
Okay, so I actually think what you're doing is exactly the right approach. So my emphasis in my recommendations here, and I'm going to get in trouble with a lot of evangelicals for saying this, but I think we need to foreground discipleship and put evangelism as secondary. Now, I'm not the only one saying this, but I think we have to say discipleship's foreground. So if we foreground it, I think that means you do exactly what you're doing. You bring the law of God, whether you call it the law of God or not. You bring it into public schools. You bring it into businesses. You don't have to use Christian language, but you teach people what are the expectations of God, whether you use God or not. And I think that any way you look at it, you're going to end up with a more ethical society, and those people who are open to the claims of Christ. I'm not saying you get rid of evangelism, but those who are open to it, then they're going to seek Christ because they want to live up to this moral standard. So I think what we've done instead is that for the last 100 years probably, or since the modern mission movement, we said we came in with evangelism, we came in with Jesus. We didn't foreground the law of God, like you're trying to say. And we've ended up with inch-deep Christians who have no moral fiber or very little. So I think I agree with you 100%. Totally agree with you.
Happy, thank you.
Yeah, indeed. No, the gentleman, I don't know. There was another gentleman that I see you are. I don't know everybody's names here.
Yeah.
That's Martin.
Yeah.
Oh, Martin. Oh, you're Martin Allaby.
Yeah. Hi.
Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful. Now, there was another gentleman, African gentleman, and I don't see him here right now, but he had a question, but I guess he's not here. So, Martin, you go ahead.
Okay. That might have been Alfred Sebahini, a friend of ours from Tanzania. He sent a chat message to say he was losing his internet connection, would have to drop out of the meeting.
Okay. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to meet you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Love your recommendations, and I hope they're widely taken up. So as you can tell from my voice, I'm British, and therefore my ancestors helped to develop the British Empire. So I feel uniquely qualified to talk about colonialism and how it might relate to some ideas about the state. And so I'm a bit with Roberto in that I think the modern state, when it works properly, is a huge benefit to countries. But when I was doing my research, I became conscious of how some European countries, Great Britain in particular, attempted to export aspects of the state to our colonies. And that happened particularly in Africa, because African countries remained part of the British Empire for longer than our Asian countries. Yeah. So I see Arpit here from India. So what I'm about to say would apply less in India than it would apply in Kenya. We've got Sarah from Kenya, I think, on the call, and less than in Nigeria, where we've got Peter on the call. So what happened was that at the time we were greatly expanding the scope of the state in the UK to create a welfare state, with the state controlling huge budgets for healthcare, education, pensions, unemployment benefits, etc. We had a deliberate policy of trying to expand the scope of the state in our residual colonies. And I think that has been an unmitigated disaster, because all the opportunities for theft and grand larceny that you describe have been perpetrated because there hasn't been either a culture of truthfulness or a powerful civil society able to hold the state to account. Another dimension to that is that the way that Britain had treated its colonies was not essentially to govern them well, but to extract resources from them, sometimes in the most cruel and unchristian ways. And having done that for many decades, it's then impossible to have a crisis of conscience in the middle of the 20th century and say, oh, that was a terrible way in which we used our power to govern those colonies, and
Right.
now we want to repent of that and be nice to our colonies and help them set up a welfare state. It's impossible to make that transition in the space of a few years. So really what we did was expand the scope of the state. The state that we had bequeathed was an exploitative and extractive one. And we see disastrous consequences of that today. And I find it very frustrating any time I read any development literature that assumes that organs of the state in poorer countries function in any manner that's remotely comparable to the way that organs of the state that have similar names would function in high-income countries with a long-established tradition of honesty and accountability. So that's a rather long spiel.
Thank you, Martin.
That's my take on the modern state, where it works and where it goes disastrously wrong.
Indeed. I wonder, Martin, if you're aware that I'm speaking primarily of Africa because I've had a larger sample to deal with from Africa, I would say. I wonder if you're aware that the students that I encounter now, there's some methodological problems with my sample. My sample are English-speaking Africans, not French-speaking. Some are French-speaking. I hesitate. Some are French-speaking. The majority are English-speaking. But both the French and the English-speaking that I have encountered, almost to a person will say that the former British colonies left a better residue than the French or Belgians. I don't know if you're aware of that. That they would, yes, they're extractive, but we feel that if we compare them, the French and the Belgians were worse. So you're familiar with that comparative.
Yeah, indeed. And I think with all these statistical analyses, it's often quite challenging to pick out the contribution of different elements. So on the one hand, there's the contribution of a Protestant culture,
Right.
which was clearly stronger in former English colonies than in former French or Belgian colonies, which were evangelized mostly by Catholic missionaries. So there's the religious dimension. But the number crunchers have picked out the contribution of an English colonial legacy as additional to the legacy of Protestantism,
Right.
and suggesting there's something about an English obsession with rules, rule keeping. So the joke that the English are the world's greatest queuers, standing in line, just that's the way we do
That
things.
fits it, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting going back to picking up on that. I'd like to go back to Roberto's comment, thinking about the high levels of corruption in Latin America. And I connected that to Roman Catholicism. However, it's interesting, Martin, that again, I've done a lot of speaking about this in Africa, so I tend to know more about this in relationship to that context than others. But what I'm finding is, at least in the formerly French colonies, while they would all say the French and the Belgians left them in a worse position, it's certainly true, for example, in DRC Congo, that the phenomenon, the one institution that is fighting corruption the best is the Catholic Church, ironically. Whereas the decentralized Protestant church, and I said this openly to 100 pastors in Eastern Congo several years ago. I said, you guys are more corrupt, and this is pastors, than the Catholic Church. They're doing a much better job, and they all agreed with me. I mean, there was nobody pushing back, and maybe it was respect for the white man, but I do find it interesting that when it comes to this, there's a bit of an irony here that in the majority Protestant, new majority Protestant countries in Africa, it seems that it's the Catholics, at least it's true in DRC, that are the only real religious institution that's standing up against corruption, whereas Protestants seem to be just swallowing up largely in a big way, with exceptions like Harry Lobster's work in South Africa.
Yeah. I'm sure, Robert, you have wider personal experience on the ground in Africa than I do.
I don't think I do, but you know.
Well, all that you describe resonates exactly with the writings of Paul Gifford. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Yes, I've used his stuff. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so that resonates exactly with his experience across a number of African countries. And I think, so the Catholic Church, on the one hand, it suffers from its very hierarchical nature and its enormous wealth centralized in the Vatican, and the resistance of a lot of powerful people to open up the vaults and be honest about what's there. But on the plus side, they do have a good theology of the common good, which I think helps churches Catholic churches in a number of countries have a sense of or develop a sense of integrity and have a healthy perspective on good governance, what that might look like. Whereas the very vociferous nature of Protestant, newer evangelical and Pentecostal churches, they don't have that sort of steer in their theology. It's a very competitive marketplace to attract wealthy pew fillers. And as you described in your list of the problems, that mitigates against giving messages about public integrity. You don't want to scare off the corrupt government official who's paying most of your bills.
Agreed.
So I'm going to jump in here to acknowledge that we're at the end of our scheduled time, but I also see that there are 4 raised hands with questions. So I do want to acknowledge that we've run out of that official time. So if you'd like to sign off, you can definitely feel free. But Bob, I don't know if you wouldn't mind staying on for a bit longer, maybe 15 to 30 minutes to go through at least these next 4 questions.
Certainly.
If that's okay with everyone else, we can extend. Thank you, Bob, for extending that time a little bit more.
And Benji, if you could just call on those people, I'm not seeing the raised hands.
Okay, yeah, so first up we have Jean-Luc from Urban Mosaic, then Kelly O'Donnell, then Joel Edwards, and then Arpit. So Jean-Luc, if you'd like to.
Hey, my name is Paulo Martinez. I am standing for Jean-Luc just briefly. He had to step out, but he left his question regarding the Ephesians 3 passage. He was wondering if, Bob, if you could explain, in your opinion, who are the rulers and authorities in heavenly places?
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful question. I was hoping somebody would ask that question. I admit that I have a bit of an unusual interpretation, but I cannot find anybody that has made sense of a way to discount my interpretation. So rulers and authorities in the heavenly places, Ephesians chapter 3:10. So my interpretation is that this is a metaphor for Roman power at the time that Paul was writing. And that by extension, this serves as a metaphor for, broadly speaking, for political and other forms of power in our societies. Now, let me explain why I think this is the case. And I'm well aware that if I have biblical scholars on here, I could be pinned against the wall. But I do believe that I have a pretty strong case here. Let me give an analogy, first of all. You and I, for those of us who live in USA, and even those who don't live in USA, are used to hearing, the White House said today, and we just instantly know that stands for a proclamation or an announcement from the US president. And we know that there is no building that speaks. It's simply a metaphor. No, it's a very comfortable metaphor that works efficiently, and it's rather evocative. So I think what I'm suggesting, first of all, is that using metaphors for high political power are not unusual in history. But there is a particularly good reason, and this is my second point, why Paul would have wanted to use such a metaphor, is that at this time he was in a Roman jail, not in he was in house arrest in Rome. So he was right at the center of Roman power when he wrote this. He was in a position where if he openly said, God has made known to Caesar through the church God's greater wisdom, then he would have been flaunting and asking for it, asking for the harsh judgment of Roman Caesaric rule. So he used code language. I think this metaphor with code language that many of the Christians in that Roman Empire, because so far at that point, the Christianity was largely within the Roman Empire. It was code language to communicate the power of Rome. So that's how I interpret it. And you can see now how I think that the purpose of our churches should be to show to political and other forms of power in our societies that God's wisdom is greater than theirs.
Thank you. That's excellent. I guess I would just be curious to know what are other points of view about interpreting that that same answer that are maybe the most popular, and why do you think that is?
Sure. Obviously the most popular, Paula, is that, and this is almost the vast majority of biblical interpreters will say that this refers to angelic powers and perhaps demonic powers in the heavenly realms, because Paul uses heavenly realms or heavenly places. So that's a traditional view. But my question, and it gets a little touchier when you see the same reference, heavenly realms, in Ephesians chapter 6. Well, my question in Ephesians 3:10 would be, why would God's greater wisdom need to be made known to angelic and demonic authorities? Sure, it's going to be showing the superiority of God's kingdom, but is that a typical ecclesiological concern that someone like Paul would bring? If when you look at the background of Paul's writing, like when he wrote Ephesians, he was writing to a church. He was writing about real issues. He was trying to connect the grand purposes of God with the day-to-day lives of people who were in this new Ephesians church, and by extension, churches everywhere. And so I think we can only interpret a passage like this in light of that larger purpose that Paul was undertaking. So I'm really glad you asked the question, Paula, because this is really a critical issue that we understand what's going on here.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
All right, I think next up we have Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. Can everyone hear me, especially Bob?
Yeah, I can hear you, Kelly.
Yeah, thanks. I've very much appreciated your sharing today, and the book that you did a few years ago, that is with my wife in the United States. We ordered it, and I'm in Geneva. My wife and I are both clinical psychologists, and so
Wonderful.
as believers long-term, and myself raised in the Roman Catholic Church for 20 years of my life, I come
Yes.
about this stuff with, I think, some helpful, maybe not unique, but helpful perspective. So very quickly, I wanted to respond in sort of a overarching way with 4 S's. You've organized your presentation in a way in terms of 4 S's, and these relate to solutions. And I'm going to be brief, and I'd just like you to maybe choose one or whatever and respond if you could. So the first one has to do with science and the important role of science. And for me, we're talking about social psychology, which can help us understand and inform our work in the area of corruption and integrity. Not exclusively so, not in terms of some type of, exalted worldview, we're going to solve all the world's problems. But there's so much research, for example, in social psychology, which just supports biblical truth, In Proverbs, for example, it says people will lie for a piece of bread, showing partiality and judgment is not good, because a person, that is you, Bob, that is me, Kelly, Benji, we will lie for a piece of bread. And social psych research shows that people lie, white lies and even black lies, regardless of their religious convictions, every single day. So my first point, my first S, has to do with maybe we could learn a little bit from social psych and science and bring that, because science means knowledge, of course, not be too afraid of it, and bring it into our understanding. Second has to do with another S, sustainable development goals. And because I work in Geneva with UN agencies, colleagues, World Health Organization, et cetera, I'm pretty familiar and fluent with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think most of us would know that Goal 16 is the one which uses the term corruption, although it's fairly weak and almost parenthetical in it. And my concern is that corruption, like so many other issues in our world, okay, the defining issues of our time, the most important issues of our time, the underlying issues of our time, everyone has their laundry list and their pet peeve about what the big issue is. And so I think sometimes, and perhaps in light of the SDGs, corruption gets compartmentalized into one of a myriad of issues that we just have to somehow kind of deal with. And underneath it all, and you look at a lot of people's comments, high level, corruption is the definitive underlying thing that's going on. So my second point has to do with SDGs and considering Christians to connect and contribute to this process which the world community has identified, is investing in, and we have a lot to offer, and at the very least we have SDG 16 to use as leverage and a platform to be able to share.
Great.
The third S has to do with how I'm summarizing, but I think your main message, if not solution, is to us, Bob. Also, SDG is the acronym that I want to use. It's Sustainable Development for Good, or for Goodness. Somehow, sorry, not development, sustainable discipleship for moral goodness and good and for virtue. And maybe that's the one you might want to unpack and respond to. I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there in light of some of our propensity to prevaricate, to distort, to be evil, but at least I think there's some hope with that. And then the final S has to do with the power of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, which we must include, I believe. It's all over Scripture, and it's, of course, just not willful effort to become more moral. The power of the Spirit that can really help us. But those are 4 S's I think that can come alongside, in some sense, the 4 causes and major problems that you've identified in your model. So if you have any thoughts, I'd appreciate it, especially on sustainable discipleship for goodness.
Yes, Kelly, it's wonderful to hear that you're working in the context that you are, and you certainly have a door and a window to people who are in influence internationally on this. So thank you for serving Christ in that context. And I love your 4 S's. At least it's a way of helping me to remember them, but I wrote them down. I'm fascinated, for example, by Jonathan Haidt's work in social and moral psychology, his moral foundations theory, which I think has significant relevance to this. And I think that potentially that moral foundations theory could be mined, I think, for some work here. So I quite agree. Let me shift to the sustainable discipleship question. And that's a nice way of putting it. I hadn't thought of that term, but I actually like that term. I may use that. So thank you. Yes, that is exactly what I'm aiming for. And I don't think I'm alone. I know that I'm not alone. I know, for example, Dr. Bob Moffat with Harvest and Disciple Nations Alliance in Phoenix, Arizona. I know for a fact that he's been talking with the top leaders of the World Evangelical Alliance about the question of whether we should be talking most about evangelism or really starting with discipleship. And so that conversation at the highest levels in the global evangelicalism is, I think, beginning to happen at some level. I think it's going to be very difficult for us. I think we've got our work cut out for us because there is a kind of, first of all, American evangelicalism has become the gold standard, whether it should be or not, for the world. I regularly have people that I meet in countries where I speak who will say, we look to the American Christian church or America in general and for guidance on how we should function. So whatever we're doing gets replicated. We Americans, I'm saying. And that, sadly, I think, has meant that we have foregrounded evangelism at the expense of discipleship for many, many, many decades. It's much more spectacular. It's much more spectacular to have a massive crusade than it is to do the hard work of discipling people. There's a certain kind of spectacularism about American Christianity. And I'm certain my British brother, he's probably quietly trying to hold his excitement at that statement, because I know a lot of Europeans see that about American Christianity. I do appreciate many of our strengths, but I think our spectacularism is leading to the wrong emphases around the world. I would rather see sustainable discipleship, to use your term, that says our job is to build the disciplines of integrity and other disciplines as well into the lives of people in our churches. Now, we cannot do this without the Holy Spirit. God is going to have to do a spiritual transformation in people's lives. And furthermore, if people are going to embrace these disciplines, they're going to have to find that they in their own power cannot do it. They cannot work their way enough. They can get on their knees, they can crawl on the ground, but they can never do it. And they're going to plead for the help of God, which comes, first of all, by following Jesus as Savior from sin. 2, by having the Holy Spirit empower them so that their traditional sin nature does not control their behavior. This is how I think we're going to have to get over somehow the American spectacularism model of evangelism and move to a grassroots model of discipling, which will bring people to Christ as they realize that only through Christ can they really become the kind of non-corrupt people who can be trusted. So thank you so much for your comments there, Kelly.
Thank you too. And I just want to come back with one thing. I appreciate everything you say. I think we are so fearfully and wonderfully flawed, that is the primordial effects of sin in us, that
Yes.
even when we do our best, and indeed that's my experience with myself and with many, many, many Christian leaders, respected people around the world who are corrupt as hell. And what I mean by that is not necessarily in every area. They're not bad people, but in social psychology research, we know that you could be totally moral, you could be altruistic, etc., in some areas, but blind and hypocritical and exploiting and hurting many people in the other areas. So it's not an all or nothing thing when we talk about corruption and discipleship and integrity, but I think we have to just continue to remember our own propensity towards heart is deceitful above all else, Jeremiah 17, etc., and call out for the Spirit, for mercy, and for what Dr. Tedros, WHO, said the other day as he was introducing the resolution on the response for COVID. He said, the biggest lesson for all of us around the world is, I should just mute and let you figure out what he might have said, but he said, humility.
Yeah, I love that.
Humility.
Which is not,
we can't do it by ourselves. We're caught flat-footed. We're overwhelmed. We make mistakes, etc. Okay, I'll leave it on that. But corruption is not all or nothing, and it's nicely compartmentalized and hidden in our own hearts and in our Christian leaders' hearts, those who are discipling us. Okay, thank you for listening.
I've discovered how much I try to hide it in my heart because I really want to come across publicly as a really great guy. But boy, we have clever ways, don't we? And the more you're in Christ, the more clever ways you learn. I mean, I get more sophisticated in knowing how to handle sin in clever ways as I follow Christ longer. It's awful. So Benji, I don't see the other hands, so you'll.
Joel, I think you had your hand up earlier, but you've taken it down. I'm not sure if you would like to add your question.
I didn't realize I'd taken it down, Benji. Happy to.
Okay.
Go. Yeah, Bob, thank you very much for the presentation. I think you did two things for us helpfully. One was try to do an analysis, so the overarching meta-narrative of what is corruption. And secondly, what does that have to do with the issue of the relationship between corruption and discipling? The first swift observation, and I know something we at FPIN have been wrestling with from time to time, is whether or not integrity and corruption are interchangeable words, and what are the nuances between those two. The second is coming to your analysis. How would you respond to the idea, some of the stuff which Martin was saying earlier, that the relationship between 18th, 19th, 20th century missional work and imperialism grew up together, so that there were issues of injustice, issues of institutionalized corruption, which sometimes the church colluded with, sometimes challenged, but both grew up, has now morphed into 21st century expressions of systemic corruption, by which the rich and the powerful in the West, so-called, actually disadvantage and compound, and sometimes actually adds to grassroots level corruption in former colonies. And with that, what is the missional heritage and legacy as a part of that sinfulness, despite all the positive things which the missionary agencies have given to other parts of the world? And I wonder, therefore, coming to the issue of discipleship and corruption, whether a part of that missional message, particularly for Protestantism, was this individualism. So to what extent has our message not so much led us down the path of a dichotomy between evangelism and discipleship, but privatization of faith and public concern? And therefore, are we talking about corruption and discipleship, or might the challenge be nurturing people, not so much in discipleship only, which can be a very privatized affair. Do I pray? Do I witness to Jesus? Do I, give good offering? Am I nice to people? But actually, citizenship, which was a fundamental and a radical element of the early church, and citizenship, which is a very different paradigm for Christian living, which takes in all elements of life, from the witness to Jesus and evangelism to being good citizens, which was the hallmark of the early church. And I wonder if a part of our problem to bring the analysis to grassroots and to deliverability is whether we need to shift the paradigm from privatized models of discipleship to more biblical understanding of citizenship.
You've gone after something, Joel, that I'm very, very interested in. I'm right now editing my second book, which raises a lot of these questions. What I am in my second book trying to in part say, and I'm not going to give you the whole thesis, but one of the key points I'm trying to make in that second book is that the model of discipleship that we have worked with for at least a century, probably a century and a half, has been one of what I call personal spirituality. Now, private and personal, we often use those interchangeably. They're really not quite the same, as you know. But I think you're onto something here. I think for reasons going back philosophically, Western philosophers, in order to protect Christianity from the onrush of rationally based scientific research, began to adopt modes of irrationality or non-rationality as an acceptable epistemology for our churches. And so that easily then, I think, fell over into or substantiated or supported the development of a personalized spirituality that you are alluding to, a Jesus and me spirituality. And so what I'm suggesting in this book is that when you look at Jesus's model of discipleship, and I quite agree with you 100%, when you look at Jesus' model of discipleship, it's a combination of both deep spirituality and radical action to bring redemptive change, whether it's through healing people or whether it's through overturning tables or whether it's through having conversations with government officials, some of which are difficult, or challenging publicly the leadership, whether religious or otherwise. So I put it, personal spirituality plus redemptive action. You've used the word citizenship, and I do like that because I think that encompasses what I'm thinking right now as well, Joel. I want to think about your notion of citizenship. I think that's right, that to come into the kingdom of God was people were profoundly aware of that in the earliest centuries of Christianity. It was a distinct citizenship, as you're alluding to. It had its rules, its practices. It was all-encompassing. The lordship of Jesus Christ was seen as a direct challenge to the lordship of Caesar. Today, we have put it all in this private domain or individualistic domain. So I think your fundamental analysis is exactly right. Now, going back to your earlier observation about missionaries in the last couple centuries, I have referenced already the same kind of privatization of spirituality. Now, how that worked together with imperialism, to me, is really complex. I've read, for example, a scholar, I can't think of his name, but he's a Cameroonian scholar who showed in his book that the missionaries who were working in the mid-1800s, which was the very earliest days of mission work in Africa, very, very earliest days, he said the evidence indicates that they were developing people who were getting and developing capacities as responsible agents in the society. And then he says in the late 19th century, you get the onrush of the British and French and Belgian colonialists. They then, he said, the research shows, push back or negated the positive things that the missionaries had done, and then created a situation in which they owned all, they, the imperialists, the colonialists, had all the power. And the people there in Africa or in their different colonies had little political power. So he's saying the missionaries were good initially, then the colonialists came by, and it appears that some missionaries cooperated with the colonialists to diminish the power of the people, and some pushed back. So it seems like it's a complex story. The other thing that I'm thinking about, Joel, is the 2012 American Political Science Review article by Woodbury. I'm forgetting his first name. Robert Woodbury from now Baylor University. His research, which has been highly referenced in lots of literature over the last 8 years, as you're probably very well aware of it, he indicates that where the Protestant conversionary missionaries went, there is today a higher rate of democratic activities or democratic results. And he says it's both correlation and causation, which of course he's getting beat up. And there's some new scholars that have just recently attacked him on his causation argument. So I think the question of how the missionaries worked with the imperialists is more complex, and I don't have the ability to sort of ferret it out here. But thank you for raising both of those. Outstanding. Thank you. Is there anyone else, Benji?
Yes, so I think we're closing up pretty closely to 10:30. So Arpit, I think you have the final question, and then we'll close up after your response.
Thank you, Benji. Thank you, Dr. Bob. It was a real privilege listening to you. My name is Arpit. I'm from India. I work for a movement called Operation Nehemiah, which basically works for financial integrity among churches and missions in India. So our scope is within the church, and you just made a statement that, hey, many of us are corrupt, and probably more corrupt than those around us. And I think that's why I resonated so much with so many of the things you said. I've read your book. It was a blessing to read it a couple of years back when it came out. Identified with the idea of shamans. It's not common in India to have shamans, but we do have idols. And I think everything that you said about shamans works and is relevant for idols almost exactly the way you mentioned it. I was just wondering. I'll get to my question straight away. Trying to understand the problem of why this is not a priority. The whole question of integrity, and trying to also practically understand how we can address that issue, particularly for a culture like ours, which doesn't even consider it as something even worth talking about. And I mean, things like evangelism, like you correctly said, is so much more attractive. It's it's a cause worth going after, and may I add, even social concerns, feeding the hungry, are things that matter a lot to people in a cultural context like mine. So I was just wondering, because many of our imperatives for integrity come out of negative language. They come out of a language of what we lose rather than what we gain. So I was just wondering, is there a possibility to discover language based on truth? I mean, it's not postmodern. It's a language based on truth of reward rather than punishment. When we talk about matters of integrity, and the second point I just wanted to ask you, in terms of, I mean, Kelly referred to the Holy Spirit and transformation. and you're talking about discipleship in general, and you get a sense that this is about a journey. This is not a switch that you make. You know, one day you're corrupt, the other day you're completely having integrity. And so, you know, is there scope of keep talking more about, instead of the law? I know you mentioned the law.
Yeah.
Is it possible to talk about the gospel, which is a transformation process, really, which is the journey, which is the whole of law and grace, and you know, combined, which keeps us on this journey of integrity, of becoming from who we are to who we want to be, and then becoming like Christ is the reward that we're all going for. So I just wondered what your thoughts on that would be.
Oh, yes. I love the way you're taking this. I love it. I think that when we emphasize the gospel of the kingdom, which is the language, of course, that Jesus is using and the gospel writers use, I think, first of all, right away, we're putting it in a very positive context, as long as we understand that Jesus is the king. And I also agree with you that, as Paul says in Galatians, language, the legal discourse, the discourse of the law, it has a tendency to sort of cloud. It has a tendency to, it can restrain, it can show our need for Christ, but it's not a particularly positive frame. And I appreciate your pushback on my emphasis on the law of God. I think probably I'm speaking right now, when I speak about that, to the highly libertarian spirit of American culture right now. And we desperately need a recovery of law, because we are so libertarian in our mindset. Now, to think of the positive discourse, right away, of course, what came to my mind was John 8:32. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I mean, this itself, it's, I think, incredibly positive to think of Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. That's all incredibly positive discourse. And I love that way of framing it. And I think if we can frame it that way, I think inherently it's going to be more positive, more welcomed, and we're going to be able to get farther down the road in our churches and in our Christian communities. But I think that the challenges against truth are really severe today. Again, I think the postmodern, that alone is really, really, really taking a toll, and it's especially infiltrating at our top leadership, and then it gets eventually drizzles down into the pews, and I don't see anything good of that. I just can't see anything good of it. I'm just deeply concerned about what's happening.
Yes, and I think that's pretty particularly relevant for India, because we don't use the word postmodern, but you know, it's a pantheistic culture,
right?
Where
Exactly.
what works is true, and so basically, everything is relative. And I think your point about discipleship is really, really well taken, in terms of the fact that discipleship has to lead to a transformation of culture.
Yeah.
Which, like you rightly pointed out, has been completely left out. In let's say, if we were to blame somebody, I mean, we could blame the Western missionaries and say, okay, they completely left this out of what we need. I think in India we are struggling to rediscover that and make it a part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I'm very keenly aware of some of the, you know, particularly one of the corruption realities in a large group of Indian churches, and it just breaks my heart. But as again, I was saying earlier, a lot of what happens in churches around the world, to one degree or another, is copying what's happening in America. Our spectacularism, which I referenced already, but the prosperity gospel, which right, comes out of America. It's sweeping through much of the country. And as my friend, and you'll know the name Vishal Mangavati, he said to me 24 years ago, he said, Bob, you do not realize that when you Westerners, Western Christians, you engage some sort of interesting innovation, he says, for you guys, it barely rocks the boat. But he says when those so-called interesting innovations like people who bark like dogs, I'm using that as an illustration. He says, when you take that to countries like ours that have no Christian cultural background, it just rocks the boat and the boat shakes and it destroys the work of God. And this is a reminder to me that what American Christians, I'm not just saying that America has all the influence. That's not going to be true forever. I already know that. But at this point, what we're doing is having real effect. And one of those things we're doing through our universities is teaching people to have a postmodern view of truth. Devastating. So thank you so much, Arpit. Where do you work in India? What part of India?
I'm based in Bangalore.
Oh, you're in Bangalore.
Yes, I'm in Bangalore.
Yes, yes.
I heard about you because of a mail that Dr. Manfred Cole wrote to you and copied me on it.
Yes.
And that's how I got to know about the book. And I have it on my Kindle right now.
Beautiful. Thank you. It's encouraging to me. That's very encouraging. Thank you.
It was an absolute feast. Thank you so much.